Hey there Blender heads, Jamie Dunbar here and welcome to chapter 5 of our Sculpting Scorbunny tutorial series. In this lesson we're going to be adding fur to our Scorbunny character here. Now if you've just joined this tutorial series and you haven't followed along with the previous 4 chapters and maybe you don't want to, maybe you just want to learn how to do fur, I've made this file right here available for anybody to download. The link will be in the description below. Now, if you have been following along with the last couple of tutorials, you'll have noticed in the last couple of lessons I was having a little bit of trouble getting the mirroring to work properly, mostly because this ear here is obviously not symmetrical, and that was causing me problems. It was also causing me problems while trying to get the fur working. The fur just didn't quite want to mirror properly. If you also have trouble with your model getting your mirroring to work, you also might want to go and download this file just to make sure that everything works cleanly for you. With that in mind, go grab either your previous model or go and download this one, and let's talk about fur. So I've got an image here from the Peter Rabbit movie, and I just wanted to talk about the actual differences in fur across the whole body. So I'm just going to zoom in a little bit here, and I'm actually going to go and look a little bit closer at Peter's brother here. Forgive me, I can't actually remember his name off the top of my head. But you'll notice that, say, the fur around his chest here, which is quite long and fluffy, and then you can look at maybe the fur on his nose, or even better here, the fur that's going up and down his ear here is much shorter and in fact more coarse. Particularly if you look, say, down here, and then as we get further and further up, you can see that it really becomes quite fluffy up here around the top of the head. The point is that there are some fairly big differences in the texture and fluffiness and length of the fur as it goes across the entire body. Now the reason I bring this up is I'm just going to quickly go and add a fur node to Scorbunny here and create some hair, and as you can see that goes absolutely bananas. We're going to want to shrink this down considerably. I'll probably be using somewhere between 2 and 4 centimeters. Now it is theoretically possible to come in here and say grab our length brush, and if we wanted to make the fur on, say, the torso here a little bit longer, we can do that, as you can see, and then we can go and shrink it, say, around the mouth. But this gets really fiddly really quickly, and trying to get these differences in fur length to blend nicely is really fiddly and frankly not worth the trouble. So what we're going to do is actually break our fur groups up. Now I've got another model over here, and this model will come with the download if you want to use this as reference. And as you can see, I've color-coded Scorbunny here. And these here are going to be our references for our fur nodes. So as you can see, I've got the blue chest and torso here. That's going to be one of our fur groups. And then the arms, face, where we can do a bunch of shorter fur, the ears, where we can maybe do it a little bit longer. So I'm going to break the fur up into these 7 or 8 different color-coded groups, just so we can get a little bit of extra control when it comes to adjusting our length and other settings. So the first thing that we want to do is get these colors, or where these colors are, these groupings, onto Scorbunny over here. So I'm just going to go and toggle our overlays back on so we can see our topology a bit better here, and I'm going to turn off our subdivision modifier just for a brief moment. So the first thing we want to do is go over to our object data over here, and we want to create a few vertex groups. This is how we will control where our fur shows up. So I'm just going to go and create, I think it's 8 different groups, and name these the same as we've got our materials named over here. So torso, face, etc. So I'm just going to jump in and quickly do that. Now that we've got those groups, we want to assign certain sections of our model to it. So fortunately, the way that we've done our UVs here makes this fairly simple. So if you just hover over, let's just say the front of Scorbunny here and tap L, you can see that as long as you've got seam or UVs selected, it will just select that patch, which is this patch over here in our UVs. So I can go and select the back, and this is for the torso here. So I'm actually also going to select the top of the legs here, just because the way that the fur flows, the way the fur flows around this area is more similar to the torso than it is to the foot. Select all of that and then go and assign those to our torso. I'll then do the same with the face. Just selecting the front here, again you can just tap L and assign those. Now I'll quickly go through. Now you can see here I've actually got a couple of faces that aren't being properly selected. So you can either just turn that to seam, which will then select everything kind of on the right side of our red seam line here. But that is also an indicator that there's something just a little bit wrong with our UVs. So if I just select these 4 faces and zoom in here, yeah, you can see that for whatever reason, we've got an extra floating island here, and just looking at this map, I can see that those should go and fit in there. I know the back of this head doesn't actually have really any color data on it, it's just all white. So I think the easiest way to fix this will just be to go to seam and just go and re-unwrap that. And if I can just go and put this back in here, and that should fix our problem there. I'll make sure that that is fixed in the file that you guys get to download. So with that fixed, just make sure that I go back to UVs there, and that does work now, that's good, and I will assign this to the back of the head. And just to make sure that that has all worked, you can come back to any one of these groups and just go select, and it'll select all the faces that are associated with that group. Okay, so that seems to have worked properly. We don't really need this guy anymore. I'm going to go and hide him. So now let's jump in and start actually adding our fur. Actually, there is one last little thing that I'm going to do before we jump into our fur. I'm just going to kind of make a bit of a blend between all of these different groups. So if we jump over into weight paint mode and have our torso selected, you can see that we've got this red coloring here, which is where our vertices are 100% assigned to this group. And that as we blend between this edge here and this edge here, you can see that it kind of fades into yellow, green, and then into a lighter blue before disappearing. Dark blue means 0% selected. I'd really like to have this blur line just be a little bit softer. That means that as we go from our torso fur node into our arm fur node, there'll be a nice transition period. So the fur on the torso will be really long towards the middle, and then as it blends into the the fur on the arm, it will kind of get smaller and disappear until the arm completely takes over. So I'm just going to go and select blur here. Make sure that X mirror is turned on under your options, and just kind of smooth that out a little bit. Okay, so with that done, now let's finally go in and create our first fur group. So we want to go to our particle properties here and just create a new group. And I'm going to call this one torso. I think we'll start with the torso because the torso is probably the easiest one to get done first. We want to swap it over to hair, and as with before, we end up with some much too long hair. So let's bring this down. I've experimented with this before, and I think for the torso, we don't want any longer than 4. Even that might be a little bit too long. We'll drop it down to, let's try 3. So now we want to go and utilize our vertice groups that we created before. So let's go down to vertex groups, and you want to select density and select the torso, and you can see that now every single hair that was here is now stuck to just that area. And we also want to go length and also set that to torso, and you'll notice that as I explained before, these fur follicles that are close to that that dividing line there will kind of shrink down and kind of fade going into the arm there. Now this is where we run into well, it's not quite so much a bug. Let's call it a feature maybe, but it's just a way that the fur doesn't really work that great for characters. So if we go over to our particle edit option now, and we go and grab the comb, and you can see that we've got X mirror turned on here, and if I just go and try to comb this, you can see that it only affects 1/2 of the model. Now that's because, I'll just undo that, when we create it using this number here, it kind of creates the fur follicles randomly, so they're not perfectly mirrored. Which can be a little bit hard to tell just because when there's so many of them, it's a little difficult to see. So what we want to do to enable us to be able to mirror here, we actually want to go and set this number down to 0. That will completely get rid of all of our fur. We now want to go back to particle mode here, and we want to go to the add brush. And now you can see that as we paint these follicles back on, you can see that we're getting them mirrored. And if we now go to our comb brush and try to brush, you can see that we do get perfect mirroring. So this is just sort of one of the limitations of the hair particle system here. If you were trying to paint grass, for example, having this not mirror wouldn't be a problem, but for characters we need this extra little bit of control, otherwise we're going to double our work. So I'm just going to go and undo those. I'm going to create them a little bit more strategically. So you can see here we've got our radius, that's just our brush size. You can also adjust that by tapping F, mousing back and forth. And then you've got the count, which is just simply the number of fur follicles that will be created within this radius. So if I go and shrink that down a long way, you can see that we'll get 10 created in a very small patch, or if I make it really big, you can see that it kind of gets spread out a little bit more. So I'm going to start by just creating a couple of follicles just around the chest here. And then I'm going to go and grab our comb brush. I'm just going to brush these lightly into place. Just kind of get them about that. And then I'm going to go and grab the puff tool here and just push them out a little bit. It might be a little bit too far. One of the things with combing them kind of directly onto the surface here is they can sometimes penetrate through a little bit. It doesn't look great when you go to render it. So I'm just going to puff those out just a little bit. And then we're going to go back to add, and we're going to turn on interpolate. So what interpolate does is it tries to follow these follicles that you've already created. So before, when we were creating them and they were just popping straight out of the surface, now when we create them, you can see that they're following along with the rest of our follicles, which is a really cool feature. That'll save us a lot of combing time. So what I like to do is turn off interpolate for a moment and just kind of go around to a few different places and just sort of create our initial fur follicles, grab the comb, brush these into place, and the ones around the back. Make sure that these are kind of where we want them to be. Again, we'll just want to puff these out a little bit. And now when we go and add and turn on interpolate, we can just kind of add them and they'll just follow along where we expect them to. Now you will notice while you're doing this that I can actually add fur to other parts of the body, which is a little bit annoying, but when we go back to object mode, our vertex groups kick in and it removes those. So just try and keep them, oops, interpolate got turned off. Just try and keep your fur follicles within that vertex group. They won't get rendered, but it could bog down your system just a little bit. So I'll just add a few more here, just trying to make sure that we don't end up with any patchiness. We've got a little bit up the back here. And that should be pretty good. I'm also just going to go and grab the cut tool and just sort of cut some of these ones off that are sort of dangling a little bit. Maybe remove them from the arm as well. Alright, so that gets done our initial pass of the torso. Don't worry, we'll have to come back over this a number of different times once we start doing some test renders and adding some additional follicles in, recombing it a little bit. There's a lot of back and forth that happens with fur. So we will be coming back to this, but for now that you've seen how to do the torso, I'm just going to run ahead a little bit, add fur to all of our other vertex groups. So I'll be back in a moment. Now remember, our ears aren't mirrored, so we're going to have to do those individually. Now here, I'm struggling to get the fur brush between the fingers, so I'm going to temporarily add a key shape to separate the fingers, and then I'll delete this key shape later. Don't forget to shrink the size of the fur on the fingertips, otherwise it's going to look a little weird. As with the fingers, I add a key shape to the toes to separate them. Okay, so that's our major fur groups set up there. The next thing we want to try to do is to start making this actually look good. So fur can be rendered in either Eevee or cycles. Now, generally speaking, as with most things, renders will look a little bit better in cycles. The shadows that get cast by the fur just look a little bit crisper in cycles, but it's also considerably slower. So what I'm thinking is we're going to stick with Eevee for this lesson, and then at some point in the future I'll do another lesson which will cover all the different settings in cycles. So make sure that you've got this set to Eevee, and drop down here to the hair tab, because we want to take this from strands to strip. Now I'm just going to jump over into rendered mode so you can see what our results are going to be. So I think strand is it's going to be a little bit faster, but it's also not going to give particularly nice results. So if we kind of just go to a side-on view here and zoom in a little bit on these hair strands, you can see that from the root to the tip, they're exactly the same width. And that's not what hair does. It starts off thick at the root and then fades off into a point. So we want to change this to strip, which will give us that effect. Which you can see has definitely worked, but also is really quite hideous at the moment. And that's because our root thickness is set too high. So let's jump back over to our particle properties here, and let's make sure that we've got the torso selected so that we can see this a little bit easier. And we want to come down to hair shape. And as you can see, the diameter root, that's our thickness at the base here, is set to 100 centimeters, which is enormous. For hair, you're probably going to be looking at a value of 1 or 2 in here. So I'm going to drop this down to 2. If we zoom back in here, hopefully the quality of this video is good enough, but you can hopefully see that the root here is reasonably thick. In fact, I can probably exaggerate it just so you can really understand. And it's thick there and thin down the bottom. So we want to keep this somewhere between probably 1 or 2 centimeters. I'm going to go with 2 to start with. So I'm just going to quickly go through and make sure that all of our fur groups here are set up so that our hair is the right thickness. Okay, so that's looking considerably better, and Scorbunny's fur now is starting to look nice and fluffy. Actually, just before we go too much further, I'm going to go and turn our subdivision modifier back on here, because our fur, all of our fur nodes here are underneath the subdivision here, and as you can see, it does affect it slightly, so it is worth having that on for this process. So the problem that we have now is that we just simply don't have enough fur. Our shape is okay, but we just don't have enough of it. So what we need to do now is add a few extras. Now before I start doing that, I'm going to show a little trick that I have here. Make sure that we've got Scorbunny selected, and I'm going to go over to our shader editor, and I'm going to change Scorbunny's base material here. Just because currently, if we go over to render here, you can see that it's actually using our Scorbunny material, which is why we're getting these colors that are working nicely, but that makes it a little bit difficult to see our fur individually. So I'm going to go and create another material here. I'm actually going to copy our Scorbunny material here and go and create a new instance of it. And I'm going to rename this one as, actually I'm going to leave that one as matte, and I'm going to rename this one as our fur matte. And now I'm going to go and change this. In fact, we will want to just make sure that this is now a sign. I'm just going to go and grab just a simple diffuse material here and plug that in instead, and just darken this a little bit so we kind of get a dark charcoal-y effect. And now you can see that we can really start to pick up all of our furs, and we can get a better idea of just how thick our fur is. So now that that's done, let's go back to our particles over here, make sure that we've got the torso selected again, and let's thicken this up a little bit. So we do this by going to Children, and you've either got Simple or Interpolated. Now, Simple kind of does some weird things. You can actually get this to work a little bit better, but Interpolated is definitely what we want to be using here. As you can see, that's already considerably thicker. So if you just go back to None, it's relatively thin. If we go to Interpolated, it gets much, much thicker. So this is what we're seeing in the viewport. This is creating 10 children hairs per every single strand to thicken this up. And this is what we're seeing in the viewport. If we were to hit render now, we'd actually get considerably more. Actually, I might even just demonstrate that. We will need to quickly create a camera. And let's just position this a little bit more nicely. I might just rearrange this a little bit. Let's go 1000 by about 1200, and that should give us a nice little block to be able to see a little bit better. Now if I just give this a quick render, let's just make sure that we're doing this over this side. Let's just return this back here. You can see this has now gone and given us a really thick coat. In fact, that's probably a little bit too thick. But because we're using Eevee and we can kind of do this in real time, we can sort of just adjust this manually and get a bit of a better idea. And actually, I think about 30 or 40, let's go 40, it's probably going to be about right. So I'll reduce the render to 40, and then when we hit render, it'll show up just that little bit thinner. So I'm just going to go through and thicken all of this up so we get a slightly better result. Okay, so that's looking like a fairly nice density of fur, but the problem that we have now is that it's really, really perfect. Like, this looks like the Scorbunny's, literally just come out of the shower, and he's just blow-dried his hair, and he's looking fabulous, which is not really all that realistic. We need to scruff him up a little bit. Not too much, because he seems to be a fairly well-bred character. Probably more like a, let's say maybe more like a golden retriever dog or something, where they do have a fairly nice groom. So he's not going to be shaggy like some sort of wild animal, but he does still need just a little bit. So to do that, we can get rid of children here now. And actually, no, sorry, it is under children, and it is now under roughness. Roughness is what we want to play with next. And specifically, all of these kind of do some slightly different things, but I like using just the random down here. So just make sure, yes, we do have the torso selected, and I'm just going to start cranking up our random value here, which will add a little bit of, as it suggests, randomness to our fur, as you can see, and that massively overdrives it. So 0.1 is probably way too big here, but we've also got the size here, which is the size of our noise. And at the moment that's set way too high. In fact, it's generally set way too high. So I'm going to drop this down to about 0.1 and see how that looks. And that's kind of crazy, but it has given us a really nice shaggy sort of look. So let's grab our random here. Let's maybe go 0.01. Have a look at that, and that's actually starting to look quite good. So if I just drop that down to 0, you can see that it shifts slightly from this really perfect groom. We'll just go 0.01. Now you can see that it's just got a little bit of randomness to it, and that's giving it a much nicer effect. So again, I'm just going to go through and add a little bit of randomness to all of these. And I'll try not to add too much to the face here, just because I want that to be still, his face should be fairly clean. Again, I probably don't want to add too much of this to the fingers. I want to keep those a little bit cleaner, and probably do something similar with the toes. And that's starting to look pretty good. Now, you might have noticed, once we started fiddling with the noisiness around the face here, we started to get the hairs coming through the band-aid here. And there's also a few other places where I wouldn't mind just either removing or making some of this fur a little bit shorter. Like, we really shouldn't be getting this strange pink fur on the nose, for example. We've got a little bit of fur that's kind of starting to grow into his eyeball. The lips, for example, should have significantly reduced fur. So let's just go in and let's tweak our vertex group on the face. So if we just go into weight paint mode, and we'll need to toggle our overlays back on so that we can start to see this. And if we just go and set our weight down to 0, we can start to paint away some of this influence. Now this is starting to lag quite a bit, and that's just simply the sheer number of furs that we've got in this scene. So I'm just going to drop back to our particle view here. I'm just going to disable most of these. As you can see, even that's taking a little bit of time. So that should help considerably. And I might also just reduce our display amount in the viewport here. I might just knock that down to about 10. Oh, whoops, I've got the toes selected there. Might leave that where it is. Go back to the face and just set that down to about 10. I can maybe even go a little bit lower. That should be enough for us to sort of get a preview here. So now if I go back to weight paint mode, this should work a little bit faster and I can start to... Oh, sorry, I've still got blur selected up here. You need to make sure that you've got draw selected, and now you can see that the color starts to change. And you might be struggling to see it a little bit, but you can see that those furs that are underneath start to disappear. So we just want to get rid of everything that's underneath the band-aid here. And I might just isolate this for a moment and make sure that I get everything. And I'm also going to start to paint back the nose a bit here, because that part of the face is usually just kind of skin, you know, a wet nose or something. It doesn't usually have fur growing out of it. And I'd also like to reduce the amount of fur that's around the eyes and in the mouth. Now you could try painting that, but that could be a little bit tricky. So instead I'm going to go back into edit mode. Let's just make sure that I've got a cage on there so that I can see this a little bit better. And I'm going to select that inner loop of the eye and the other eye here, and I'm going to tap Control plus twice and go back to our vertex group and remove that from the face. And now if we go back to weight paint mode, you can see that that has now disappeared. But we don't want this to be this kind of hard edge. We want these furs to kind of shrink down and slowly disappear as they get closer and closer to the eyeball. So to do that, we can just blur this a little bit. And you can see that some of those furs start to come back, but they're a little bit shorter than they were. So that's good. And let's do the same with the mouth here. Just going to go inside the head a little bit, select a ring through here, hold down Control Alt and just click on an edge loop. And again, just go Control plus, hit that, I think twice in this case. And again, go and remove that from the face, drop back into weight paint mode. And again, let's just blur this out a bit. So that should make the face look a little bit cleaner. So I think I might be ready now. Let's just unisolate that. I think I might be ready now to do a little bit of a test render and just see how this is looking in our final render before we go in and do too much more tweaking. You can see that I've still got this model over here that's coming up in our render, so I might just go and hide all of that, hide that from the render, and go back to our particle groups here. And in the same way that you can turn objects on and off or make sure that they appear or don't appear in the render, you can do the same here. So we can actually disable that fur on the face and all of this will still render. So let's just give this a quick little test. Okay, now render's complete. That took all of about 5 seconds, which is just testament to how fast Eevee actually is. And this is not looking too bad. I mean, it looks a little bit creepy at the moment, just because we've got that black skin underneath here. But broadly speaking, our fur coverage and the amount of roughness and shag that it has to it is pretty good. I might want to just blur a little bit more as we get into this band-aid here. We've kind of got a really square edge going on there. And I might want to maybe add a little bit more fur back in around the eyes. And I might want to reduce a little bit further around the mouth too. I think I might also make the fur on the ears a little bit longer and reduce the length of the fur there. All right, I think that's enough for us to play with a little bit. Let's go back into weight paint mode. Make sure we've got our blur selected here, and let's just make sure that this is actually blurring in as we get closer to the nose and the band-aid there. That should help. And I also think I will just go and paint a little bit more out from the lips. Just reduce that a little bit. And then again, come back in with the blur tool and just blur that back in a little bit. Okay, we'll give that a look in a moment. And I also want to make the fur on the ears a little bit longer. So let's go back to the ears here and make sure that we can see that. Might just jump over into material preview so I can see this a little bit better. Let's go to particles. Actually, I can see it slightly better in solid mode now. Let's go to length. Let's make sure under tools that we've got grow selected, not shrink. And if you turn on wireframe, you'll be able to make both the front and the back faces grow at the same time. So let's just click and drag over that a little bit, and that should give us something that's not too bad. And I might just go back to the face as well. Go into particle edit, and I might just shrink the fur around the mouth as well. I might just crank my strength up a little bit just to make this shrink a little bit faster. That should be good. I might do the same around the eyes. And maybe even a little bit just around that band-aid a little bit. Okay, I'll just turn those off so that our viewport works reasonably quickly, and I'll give this another quick test render. Okay, I like this a little bit better. We've lost a little bit of the fur around the mouth and the eyes. I think that's a little bit nicer. We do seem to be just getting a little bit of weird... The direction of the fur seems a little bit off, just kind of around that lower jaw there. The rest of it I think looks fairly okay, but I might just quickly go in and try to brush that a little bit. In fact, yeah, you can kind of see it. It's exactly here. You can see that the fur is kind of arcing down here and arcing up there. And it's just a little bit too much. So I'm just going to try and blend that in a little bit nicer. And I think that should give us something pretty close. Now I also think we might need a few more furs on the face here, just to kind of try to patch up these little gaps that we're getting around the eyes. So I'm going to go down and let's try cranking this up to 40. Let's see how that looks in a render. So I'll just give it a quick save and hit render again. Okay, I wasn't 100% happy with that, so I've just cranked it up to 60, and I think that's starting to look a little bit better. So I'm just going to go back to our shader editor here, and I'm going to re-plug in Scorbunny's skin material, so we get this white and orange stripy dude back. And I'm just going to give that a render, so that'll get rid of our black skin here, and then the fur and the skin will start to blend together a little bit better, and it'll start to fill in some of these gaps that we're getting. So I'll just go and give that another quick render. And that I'm pretty happy with. You can see we've got a nice little bit of fuzz around the head here, and we've got nice density, a nice thickness to the fur, and I think this is starting to look really cute. But there's a couple of little things left that I just want to add to really push this thing to the next level. So the first thing that I want to add is what's known as flyaway hairs, and that's these little random strands that just kind of don't really follow the rest of the hair groom. They just kind of go off randomly on their own, and animals get them too. So I just pulled up a couple of little photos of rabbits here, and you can see, I mean, this rabbit kind of looks like it's been through the wars a little bit. He's very, a little bit messy. You can see that he's got a couple of little flyaway hairs on the back there. You can see that there's definitely some kind of sitting around the head. And if we jump over to this one here, you can see this little fellow has it too. Some little tufts sort of coming off the head. I think it's particularly obvious on the ears here, where you can see you've just got these random little strands that just don't really follow the rest of the groom. And that's going to add a little bit of extra realism. So let's go and add that. So I'm going to go and add yet another fur node here. I'm just going to call this one Flyaway. Make it a hair, and that's obviously far too big. In this case, we do want them to kind of stick out from the groom a little bit, so I might just turn our torso back on so I can get a bit of an idea of just how far that's sticking out. And 2 to 3 centimeters is probably going to be okay. I might just change our hair shape just because that's kind of throwing me off a little bit. And those still might be a little long, so we will drop that back down to about 2 centimeters, and that's looking pretty good. Now I'm not going to bother making a vertex group for this because I'm going to just kind of add them a little bit randomly, and then I'm going to keep them away from, say, areas like the face, just because that could end up being a little bit of a distraction. But we will still go and add them manually, and that way we can avoid them from appearing all over the face. So let's jump back into particle edit mode here, make sure we've got add selected, and I'm just going to keep this count really low and use a nice big brush. And I'm mostly going to be putting this over the torso, and I think I've still got interpolated selected there. We will just kind of have these stick fairly straight out from our groom. If you've only got one selected here and you try to draw, you end up drawing this really straight line of hairs. So just make sure if you've only got one selected there that you're just kind of tapping rather than clicking and dragging. Now in this case, because there's such kind of random hairs, we may not need to use interpolated here. I think that might just kind of overdo it a little bit. So if you do choose to use interpolated, just make sure you keep a very small count. I'm actually going to leave mine off. Oh, actually no, I'm going to have to go back on that. We are going to need to have interpolated on and keep this at a really low amount. Otherwise we don't get our roughness controls in here, and we definitely want to add a nice little bit of fuzzy kink to these. So I might just go zoom in on one over here and just add a little bit of randomness to it. And I might just kind of push this a little bit higher than I have in other places. Okay, just going to give that a test render and see how that's looking. And actually I'm just going to quickly jump over to slot 2 here and render this, just so we can go back and forth between our 2 images here and get a bit of a better idea of how this is working. And as you can see, it's fairly subtle, but we just get these little bits of randomness all over the body. And we do seem to be getting a little bit around the eyes that we might need to fix. But I definitely like that. That should cover us for our flyaways. I will just see if I can't get this little bit removed from the eyes. Those probably shouldn't be there. Oh, and I think this is mostly because we've just got our render amount set to 100 and our display amount set to 3. So I might just kind of go for somewhere in between there. Let's try with about 5, and let's just see whether that's fixed our problem. We'll definitely get a lot less now, but yeah, that seems to have cleared up most of what's happening around our eyes. And we're still getting a little bit of these flyaway hairs, but I think we still need more of them. So let's try cranking this up to about 20 and seeing how that goes. And that's definitely adding that back in. I might just try making these a little bit longer. I'd like them to stand out a little bit more. So let's just go and grab our length, go grab the full body here. Make sure we are set to grow, not shrink. Let's just pull those out a little bit further and see how that's looking. There we go, now we're really starting to get some of that randomness that I'd like to see. We are still getting a little too much around the eyes, and I can only assume that that's because of this interpolation because we really didn't paint anything around the eyes. Just turn all of this off so I can see this a little bit better. There's definitely no strands around there, so I can only assume that this interpolation is just kind of pushing the radius of those children particles a little bit too far. So I think, I was hoping I wouldn't have to do this, but I think we will still have to make a vertex group for this. And we can just kind of select everything and hit assign, and then we're just going to want to grab some loops around the eyes, and the inside of the mouth. Let's just remove a fair chunk of that. Just go remove, and I'll give us a little bit of breathing room around the mouth. So that's where the rest of our flyaway furs will appear. I might just take them off the fingers and hands as well. And maybe remove them from the toes. Invert that selection with Control I and go remove. And that's where our flyaway hairs will appear. So let's just go back to our particle node here and come down to our vertex groups and just go density, flyaway, and length, flyaway. With a bit of luck, that will have removed anything sitting around the eyes. And that's heaps better. You can see as I flick back and forth between slot 1 and 2. By the way, you can just use your keyboard, tapping 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to change your slot number. So you can see that we're getting our little flyaway hairs on the arms, but not on the face anymore. So that's much better. Okay, let's jump over and add. I think we've got another 2 groups here that we can add just to give this a little bit more realism and bring this design a little bit more in line with the original artwork. Now, it's not immediately obvious in our original artwork here, but if we have a look at some other images, Scorbunny does actually have a little poofy tail, and we don't have anything like that yet. Now, in this instance, it's just this tiny little poofy tail, kind of looks a little bit stuck on. Works perfectly fine for this cartoony sort of style, but I want to do something that's a little bit more realistic. So if you have a look at some actual rabbit tails here, they're kind of just little puff balls that just kind of extend from the backside a little bit. These ones are particularly cute. And if you go and have a look at Snowball here from Life of Pets, in fact, just while we're here, have a look at all the little flyaway hairs. Snowball has a lot of them. But you can see just another little poofy sort of tail at the back there. So let's go and add a little tail. And with a little bit of luck, I shouldn't need to play around with the vertex groups here. We should just be able to add this ourselves. And this is going to need to be fairly long. Again, let's just go to our hair shape. Drop that down to about 2 so we can see this a little bit better. And let's get an estimate for how long we want these hairs to be. Yeah, we're probably looking at somewhere around about 10 centimeters. And we can always extend that if we need to. So let's go and set that number to 0. Go into our particle edit mode, grab our add tool, and let's just add a little puffball right at the base here. I'll just lower that a little bit. In fact, I'm just going to up my count a little bit here. So that's let's go with about 5. That's probably not too bad. We will obviously need to do some considerable reshaping here, but let's start with that. I'm just going to nip away some of this little excess that we've created off to the sides, maybe just a little bit from the top. Okay, so let's jump into our comb mode here, and I might just go to the side view here, and let's kind of comb these a little bit more into place. Okay, I think that might be okay. So let's go to our children. We'll definitely want to add a few interpolated here, although that is really pushing it quite a long way. You can see that we go from there to kind of all over the body. So I might actually try using simple here. Now our radius is set way too high, which is why this is flying all over the place. So I'm just going to set our radius back to 0 for a moment, and just slowly increase that number so we get something a little bit more like that. And even that's probably a little bit too large. Let's go and set this to somewhere about 5 to 10. We do want this to be fairly dense fur here, because unlike on the body, we can't kind of hide it with the underlying material. This is just kind of popping out. So I might go with 10, not 1, 10 here. We might just give this a little test render. Well, actually, first let's add our little bit of randomness. Might set this one a little bit higher than some of the others I've used, just so it has a little bit more puffiness. And let's go back to our camera here, and we will need to just adjust it slightly to get a view of the tail. And let's give this a quick test render. And that's not looking too bad. I think it definitely needs to be a bit more dense. So let's go back to our display and render amount here. Let's crank this up to, let's go maybe 25. And I feel like that's just sticking out a little bit too far. So let's go back. And in fact, we don't need to use our particle edit to adjust the length here. We can just use this here. Let's shrink this down a bit. Let's go with maybe about 0.6. Let's have a look at that. Okay, again, that's looking pretty good. I think I still want it to be a little bit longer than that. Let's maybe go 0.75. I might just adjust the camera a little bit here so I can get a slightly better view. This is good, but I think it's starting to look just a little bit too poofy for my liking. So I might just shrink our radius down. Whoops. And just reduce our random factor a little bit here. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. I might still make it just a little bit thicker. Let's maybe jump this up to about 40. And one last little thing that I wouldn't mind doing. We're getting a little bit of kink in here. You can actually see the individual vertices of our hair here, and that's just because these furs are so much longer. We probably should have added a few extra segments here. Fortunately, there is a way to kind of compensate for that rather than just redoing it. We can just go down to render here. We can turn on B-spline, and if we need to, we can up our steps a little bit, and that'll just smooth it out just a little bit. So I'll just give that another quick test. And as you can see, that's kind of smoothed them out quite a bit, which is kind of nice. And I might still just push these together a little bit more. Just reduce that radius again. This isn't too bad, but I kind of want this base to be a little bit thicker. I'm just going to go and drop over into rendered mode. Okay, we are actually getting some slightly different results there. So let's just go back into particle edit, and I just want to make this base a little bit wider. Okay, and I think that's something I'm going to be fairly happy with, so I'm just going to reduce our display amount a little bit there. And now let's move on to our final little patch. We still need to add these extra little bit of kind of fluffy bits around his cheeks. We've kind of got a little bit of it already with the face and the head here, but I just want to kind of emphasize that and obviously add in his second little tuft here. So let's go and add a cheeks fur group. Now with this one, I think I will add a vertex group. So let's go and grab that vertex right there, and let's just hit plus a couple of times. Select those. Actually, let me just go in, select both sides, so we can get this mirrored. Now hit plus a couple of times. Let's just grab those ones around the edges. I think I might just go one higher than that. Let's try that. So we'll go and create a new group, call it cheeks, and assign those vertices. And go back to our particle nodes over here. Change it to hair, first of all. Give it our 2 centimeter length. Oh, this one's actually going to need to be a little bit bigger. So this one might be closer to about 5 or 6. Let's go with 6 to start with. And let's make sure that our hair shape is down to 2 centimeters. And set our vertex group so we can just start to see this a little bit easier. Cheeks. And I think I still might even go a little bit longer than that. Let's maybe try 10. 10's fairly large, but I think we might try that and see if we can't comb that into place. So let's go and set our emission number down to 0 and paint these in manually so we get our mirroring back. I'll just move this across a little bit so we've got a little bit more space here. And just kind of draw this in. And I might just give this another little test render just to see where we're up to. I'll just bring our camera back around over here somewhere so we can get a little bit of a better view of that. So let's just give this a quick little test. And that actually looks pretty good. I'm reasonably happy with that. I'm just noticing there's a little bit of a kind of a kink here as we come down into the head again, and it kind of kinks in a little bit before coming back out. I'd like to try to blend that. We're getting it a little bit at the top too. And I think the best way to do that will be going back to our weight painting here. And let's just grab our blur tool and just make sure that this kind of fades out a little bit more. So something a little bit more like that. And I think we're just about ready to go for a full body render again. I'll just have a quick check over my settings. I think we've got everything we need here. I might just make this a tiny little bit thicker, not much. I think we might just jump that up to about 30. Apologies for my virus scanner there. And I think we're good. All right, let's give this one last little test render, and we might be just about done with the fur here. Okay, so that looks pretty good. We seem to have got rid of most of our little kink sort of going on there. Only thing is his head's starting to look really quite white. I might shrink these cheeks down just a little bit. With a little bit of luck, we might just be able to do that with this control. And just sort of bring them, let's go maybe about 0.5. In fact, I don't think this length just isn't quite working for me. I might actually go and put that back up to 1 again. And I might try doing this with our length in here. And just kind of shrink this down a little bit more manually. So maybe something a bit more like that, and I might puff this lower bit out a little bit. Make sure it still comes into a point at the end though. I just make this section just a little bit longer. And again, just puff those tips out just a bit, making sure that it still comes to a point on the sides. And same deal here. Okay, give that a little test render. Alright, yeah, I'm definitely liking that a little bit more. I might still just shrink this down, maybe to only about 0.7, 0.8. Let's try 0.7 and just have a look. He's just kind of poking out of his head a little bit more than I'd like it to. And that, I think, is pretty close. Again, I'm just going to tweak this bottom one so that it points up a little bit. Just try to pull these last couple of little hairs back in just so we can separate those groups just a little bit more. Okay, you know what? I think I'm fairly happy with this. This is one of the things with fur, you can kind of go back and forth and noodle with it for a long time. In fact, before our next lesson, I might even go in and do a little bit more noodling with this myself. But I think for this tutorial, I think we're done. And in the next tutorial, we're going to be looking at using the new pose brush. Put this little fellow into this little pose and put out a final render. So I will see you then.